Section 55 of John Inglesant, A Romance. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. John Inglesant, A Romance, by Joseph Henry Shorthouse. Chapter 35, Part 2. The sun sank below the hills. The bell went on tolling monotonously through the deepening gloom. Dazed and faint, Malvolti followed its tones into the chapel where the vesper service began. When it was ended, the miserable man spoke to one of the monks and craved some food. Deprived of his last hope, his senses faint and dull with weariness and hunger, and lulled by the soft strains of devout sound, his life confessed at last to have been completely a failure, and the wages of sin to have turned to withered leaves in his hand. His heart was more disposed than perhaps it had ever been to listen to the soft accents of penitence, and to hear the whispering murmur that haunts the shadowy walks of mortified repentance. Comforted by food, the kindly words of pity and exhortation stole upon his senses, and he almost fancied that he might find a home and peace without further wandering and punishment. He was much deceived. He inquired concerning the fate of those whom, debased and selfish as he was, he still loved, especially now when this sight of long-forgotten but still familiar places recalled the past and seemed to obliterate the intervening years. The monks told him a story of sorrow and of sin, such as he himself often had participated in, and would have heard at another time with a smile of indifference. His stepfather was dead, killed in a feud which his own insolent temper had provoked. His mother and sister had continued for some time to live in the same house, and there perhaps he might have found them, had not a gentleman whose convenience had led him to claim the hospitality of the monastery for a night's rest chanced to see his sister in the morning as he mounted his horse. The sight of a face whose beauty combined a haughty clearness of outline with a certain coy softness of expression and a figure of perfect form detained him from his intended journey, and he obtained admittance into the widow's house. What wizard arts he practised the monks did not know, but when he departed he left anxiety and remorse where he had found content and a certain peace. In due time the two women, despairing of his return, had followed him, and the younger, the monks had heard, and they believed the report, ill-treated and spurned, was now living in Florence a life of sin. The softened expression of rest and penitence which had begun to show itself in Malvolti's face left it, and the more habitual one of cruel and hungry sin returned as he inquired, "Did the reverend fathers remember the name of this man?" The good monks hesitated as they saw the look in the inquirer's face, but it was not their duty to conceal the truth from one who undoubtedly had a right to be informed of it. "It is our duty to practise forgiveness even of the greatest injuries, my son," one of them replied. "Our blessed Lord has enjoined it, and left us this as an example, that he has forgiven us." The man was called Il Cavaliere di Guardino. The monks were relieved when they saw that their guest showed no emotion upon hearing this name. Only he said that he must go to Florence and endeavour to find his sister. But in truth there was in the man's mind, under a calm exterior, a crisis of feeling not easy to describe. That the Cavaliere, his familiar accomplice, in whose company and by whose aid he had himself so often committed ravages upon the innocent, should, in the chance medley of life, be selected to inflict this blow, affected him in a strange and unaccustomed way, with a sense of a hitherto unrecognized justice at work among the affairs of men. He was so utterly at the end of all his hopes, life was so completely closed to him, and his soul was so sorely stricken in return for all his sins in the only holy and sacred spot that remained in his fallen nature. his love and remembrance of his sister, that it seemed as if a revulsion of feeling might take place, and that in this depth and slough there might appear, though dimly, the possibility of an entrance into a higher life. He was better known in Florence than in any city of Italy, except Rome, and if he went there his violent death was almost certain, yet he determined to go. He assured Inglesant afterwards, in relating the story, that his object was not revenge, but that his desire was to seek out and rescue his sister. Revenge doubtless brooded in his mind, but it was not the motive which urged him onward. He told Inglesant a strange story of his weary journey to Florence, subsisting on charity from convent to convent, of his wandering up and down in the beautiful city, worn out with hunger and fatigue, unknown and hiding himself from recognition. Amid the grim forms of vice that haunted the shadowy recesses of the older parts of the city, in the vaulted halls of deserted palaces, and the massive fastnesses of patrician strife, he flitted like a ghost, pale and despairing, urged on by a restless desire that knew no respite. In these dens of a reckless life, which had thrown off all restraint and decorum, he recognized many whom he had known in other days and in far different places. In these gloomy halls, which had once been bright with youth and gaiety, but were now hideous with poverty and crime, in which the windows were darkened and the coloured ceilings and frescoed walls were blurred with smoke and damp, and which were surrounded by narrow alleys which shut out the light and cut them off from all connection with the outer world. He at last heard of the cavalier. He was told that, flying from Rome after his sister's marriage, he had been arrested for some offence in the south of Italy, and those into whose hands he fell being old enemies, and bearing him some grudge, he was thrown into prison, and even condemned to the galleys, for, since the papal election, he was no longer able to claim even a shadow of protection from any of the great families who had once been his patrons. After a short imprisonment he was deputed, among others, to perform some such office as Inglesant had seen undertaken by the slaves in Naples, for the plague had raged for some summers past with more or less intensity in southern Italy. While engaged in this work he had managed to make his escape, and had not long since arrived in Florence, where he had kept himself closely concealed. Malvolti was told the secret lurking place where he might probably be found. "It was a brilliantly hot afternoon," continued Malvolti, speaking very slowly. "You will wonder that I tell you this, but it was the last time that I ever saw the sun. I remember the bright and burning pavements, even in the narrow alleys out of which I turned into the long and dark entries and vaulted rooms. I followed some persons who entered before me, and some voices which led me onward into a long and lofty room in the upper stories, at the farther end of which, before a high window partially boarded up, some men were at play. As I came up the room, all the other parts of which lay in deep shadow, the light fell strongly upon a corner of the table and upon the man who was casting the dice. He had just thrown his chance, and he turned his head as I came up. He appeared to be naked, except his slippers and a cloak or blanket of white cloth with pale yellow stripes. His hair was closely cropped. His face, which was pale and aquiline, was scarred and seamed with deep lines of guilt and misery, especially round the eyes, from which flashed a lurid light, and his lips were parted with a mocking and satanic laugh. His dark and massive throat and chest, and his long and sinewy arms, forced their way out of the cloth with which he was wrapped, and the lean fingers of both hands, which crossed each other convulsively, were pointed exultingly to the deuce of ace which he had thrown. The last sight I ever saw, the last sight my eyes will ever behold until they open before the throne of God, was this demon-like figure standing out clear and distinct against the shadowy gloom in which dim figures seemed to move, and the dice upon the table by his side. He burst out into a wild and mocking laugh. "Ah, Malvolti," he said, "you were ever unlucky at the dice. Come and take your chances in the next main." I know not what fury possessed me, nor why, at that moment especially, this man's mocking villainy inspired me with such headlong rage. I remembered nothing but the crimes and wrongs which he had perpetrated. I drew the dagger I carried beneath my clothes, and sprang upon him with a cry as wild as his own. What happened I cannot tell. I seemed to hear the laughter of fiends, and to feel the tortures of hell on every side. Then all was darkness and the grave. Overpowered, as it seemed, by the recollection of his sufferings, the friar paused and sank upon his knees upon the pavement. The miserere had died away, and a profound gloom, broken only by the flicker of tapers, filled the church. Inglesant was deeply moved, less, however, by sympathy with the man's story than by the consciousness of the emotions which he himself experienced. It was scarcely possible to believe that he was the same man who, some short years before, had longed for this meeting with a bloodthirsty desire that he might take some terrible vengeance upon his brother's murderer. Now he stood before the same murderer who not so long before had attempted to take his life also, with perhaps the very dagger of which he now spoke, and as he looked down upon him, no feeling but that of pity was in his heart. In the presence of the awful visitant, who at that moment was filling the city which lay around them with death and corruption, and before whose eternal power the strife and enmity of man shrank away appalled and silenced, it was not wonderful that inordinate hate should cease. But as he gazed upon the prostrate man before him, an awe-inspiring feeling took possession of Inglesant's mind, which still more effectually crushed every sentiment of anger or revenge. The significance of his own half-conceived action was revealed to him, and he recognized with something approaching to terror that the cause was no longer his, that another hand had interposed to strike, and that his sword had spared the murderer of his brother only that he might become the victim of that divine vengeance which has said, "I will repay." The friar rose from his knees. I found myself in the monastery of the Cappuccini, on the bank of the river, blind, and holding life by the faintest thread. That I lived was a miracle. I'd been struck with some 20 wounds, and in mere wantonness my eyes had been pierced as I lay apparently dead. I was thrown into the river, which flowed by gloomy vaults beneath the houses, and had been carried down by the stream to the garden of a monastery, where I was found. As I recovered strength, the monks thought that my reason would not survive. For days and nights I lay bound a raving madman. At last, when my pains subsided, and my mind was a little calmed and subdued, I was sent out into the world, and begged my way from village to village, not caring where I went, my mind an utter blank, filled only now and then with horrible sights and dreams. I had no sense of God or Christ, no feeling but a blind, senseless despair and confusion. Thus I wandered on. I got at last a boy to lead me and buy me food. I know not why I did not rather lie down and die. Sometimes I did fling myself down, resolving not to move again, but some love of life or some divine prompting caused me to rise and wander on in my miserable path. At last, towards the end of the year, I came to Rome, and I wandered about the city seeking alms. The boy who led me, and who had attached himself to me, God knows why, told me all he saw and all that passed. And I, who knew every phase and incident of Roman life, explained to him such things in a languid and indifferent way, for I found no pleasure nor relief in anything. I grew more and more miserable. Our life was hard, and we were ill-fed, and the terrors of my memory haunted my spirits, weakened and depressed for want of food. The forms of those whom I had wronged, nay, murdered, lay before me. They rose and looked upon me from every side. My misery was greater than I could bear. I desired death, and tried to accomplish it, but my hand always failed. I bought poison, but my boy watched me, and changed the drink. I did not know this, and expected death. It did not come. Then suddenly, as I lay in a kind of trance, that morning in the mountain pass came into my remembrance, and it flashed suddenly into my mind that I was not my own, that no poison could hurt me, no sword slay me, that the sword of vengeance was in the Lord's hand, and would work his will alone. What greater punishment could be in store for me, I knew not, but stunned by this idea, I ceased to strive and cry any more. I waited in silence for the final blow. It came. The year had come nearly to an end, and it was Christmas Eve. All day long in the churches in Rome had the services, the processions, the religious shows gone on. My boy and I had followed them one by one, and he had, in his boyish way, told me all that he saw. The new pope went in procession to St. Giovanni in Laterano, with all the cardinals, patriarchs, archbishops, and bishops, all the nobility, courtiers, and interminable length of attendants, Switzers, soldiers, led horses, servants, pages, rich coaches, litters, and people of every class under triumphal arches, with all excess of joy and triumph. As midnight drew on, the streets were as light as day. Every pageant became more gorgeous, every service more sweet and ravishing, every sermon more passionate. I saw it all in my mind's eye, all and much besides. I saw in every church lighted by sacred tapers before the crucifix the pageants and ceremonies that, in every form and to every sense, present the story of the mystic birth of that divine fact that alone can stay the longing which, since man walked the earth, they have uttered in every tongue, that the deity would come down and dwell with man. We had wandered through all the churches, and at last, wearied out, we reached the Capitol and sank down beneath the balusters at the top of the marble stairs. Close by, in the Aracelli, the simple country people and the faithful, whose hearts were as those of little children, kneeling as the shepherds knelt upon the plains of Bethlehem, saw the Christ child lying in a manger, marked out from common childhood by a mystic light which shone from his face and form, while the organ harmonies which filled the church resigned their wonted splendours, and bent for once to pastoral melodies which, born amid the rustling of sedges by the river bank, have wandered down through the reed music and festivals of the country people, till they grew to be the most fitting tones of a religion which takes its aptest similes from the vineyard and the flock. All over Rome the flicker of the bonfires mingled with the starlight. I was blind, yet I saw much that would have been hidden from me had I been able to see. I saw across the roofs before me the dome of the Pantheon and St. Peter's, and the long line of the Vatican, and the round outline of St. Angelo in the light of the waning moon. This I should have seen had I had my sight, but I saw behind me now what otherwise I should not have seen, the form and the lines of arches and ruins, and beyond these the walks of the Aventine and of the Coelian, with their vineyards and white convents and tall poplar and cypress trees. I saw beyond them the great churches of the Lateran and Santa Croce in Jerusalem, standing out from the green country, pale and spectral in the light. To the left I saw Santa Maria Maggiore, stately and gorgeous, facing the long streets of palaces and courts, and the gardens and terraces of the Quirinale, all distinct and clear in the mystic light. The white light covered the earth like a shroud, and over the vault of the sky were traced by the pale stars strange and obscure forms, as over the dome of St. Peter's at evening when the church is dim. A confused sound filled my ears, a sound of chanting and of praise for that advent that brought peace to men, a sound of innumerable passing feet in all the churches and basilicas. I saw the dead Christs over the altars and the kneeling crowds around. Suddenly it seemed to me that I was conscious of a general movement and rush of feet, and that a strange and wild excitement prevailed in every region of Rome. The churches became emptied, the people pouring out into the streets, the dead Christs above the altars faded from their crosses, and the sacred tapers went out of their own accord. For it spread through Rome as in a moment that a miracle had happened at the Aracelli, and that the living Christ was come. From where I stood I could see the throngs of people pouring through every street and lane, and thronging up to the Campidoglio and the stairs, and from the distance and the pale Campagna and San Paolo without the walls, and from subterranean Rome, where the martyrs and confessors lie, I could see strange and mystic shapes come sweeping in through the brilliant light. He came down the steps of the Aracelli, and the sky was full of star-like forms, wonderful and gracious, and all the steps of the Capitol were full of people, down to the square of the Aracelli, and up to the statue of Aurelius on horseback above. And the summit of the Capitol, among the statues and the leads of the palace, Caffarelli, were full of eager forms, for the starlight was so clear that all might see, and the dead gods and the fauns and the satyrs and the old pagans that lurked in the secret hiding places of the ruins of the Caesars crowded up the steps out of the Forum, and came round the outskirts of the crowd, and stirred in the fallen pillars that they might see. And Castor and Pollux that stood by their unsaddled horses at the top of the stairs left them unheeded, and came to see. And the Merceres who stood bound broke his bonds and came to see. And spectral forms swept in from the distance and the light, and the air was full of powers and existences, and the earth rocked as at the judgment day. He came down the steps into the Campidoglio, and he came to me. He was not at all like the pictures of the saints, for he was pale and worn and thin, as though the fight was not yet half over. Ah, no, but through this pale and worn look shone infinite power, and undying love, and unquestionable resolve. The crowd fell back on every side, but when he came to me he stopped. Ah, he said, is it thou? What doest thou here? Knowest thou not that thou art mine, thrice mine, mine centuries ago, when I hung upon the cross on Calvary for such as thou, mine years ago, when thou camest a little child to the font, mine once again, when forfeit by every law, thou wast given over to me by one who is a servant and friend of mine. Surely I will repay. As he spoke, a shudder and a trembling ran through the crowd, as if stirred by the breath of his voice. Nature seemed to rally and to grow beneath him, and heaven to bend down to touch the earth. A healing sense of help and comfort like the gentle dew visited the weary heart. A great cry and shout rose from the crowd, and he passed on, but among 10,000 times 10,000 I should know him, and amid the tumult of a universe I should hear the faintest whisper of his voice. The friar stopped and looked at Inglesant with his darkened eyeballs, as though he could read his looks. Inglesant gazed at him in silence. That the man was crazed he had no doubt, but that his madness should have taken this particular form appeared to his listener scarcely less miraculous than if every word of his wonderful story had been true. "Heard you nothing else?" he said at last. An expression of something like trouble passed over the other's face. "No," he said in a quieter voice. By this time it was morning. The artillery of St. Angelo went off. His Holiness sang Mass, and all day long was exposed the cradle of the Lord. There was another pause, which Inglesant scarcely knew how to break. Then he said, "And have you heard nothing since of the cavalier?" "He is in this neighbourhood," said Malvolti, "but I have not found him. I wondered, and was impatient, ignorant and foolish as I am. Now I know the reason. The Lord waited till you came. How could he be found except by us both? We must lose no time, or it will be too late. How did you know that he was here?" Inglesant told him. "It was the Lord's doing," said the friar, a light breaking over his darkened face. "It was Capici. You remember at Florence the leader of that extravagant frolic of the Carnival, who was dressed as a corpse?" "I remember," said Inglesant, "and the poor English lad who was killed." "He is one of the Lord's servants," continued the friar, "whom he called very late. I do not know that he was guilty of any particular sins, but he was the heir of a poor family, and lived for many years in luxury and excess. He was brought under the influence of Molinos's party, and shortly after I had seen the Lord, he came to me to know whether he should become a religious. I told him I thought there was a time of trial and of sifting for the Lord's people at hand, and that I thought the strongholds were the safest spots. He joined the Order des Servi not 3 weeks ago. I was with him at Frascati, at the house of the Cappuccini, when I heard that the cavalier was here. You must have seen him 3 or 4 days afterwards." End of Section 55.